If the macabre narrative of Eric XIV of Sweden is any indication, reigning as a 16th century king was challenging. Then again, Eric was unstable, amoral, and responsible for one of the most notorious deeds in royal history. Indeed, his remarkably sanguinary reign nearly warranted his infamous demise. Eric XIV's brutal regime concluded with a coup, and the deranged king complacently entered a cell, oblivious to the gruesome destiny awaiting him. Though Eric XIV would soon acquire a reputation as one of Sweden's most demented figures, his origins were tragic in a different manner. However, their relationship had a sinister aspect. Although Dionysius was one of Eric's staunchest advocates, as we shall see, the king would later reciprocate with a savage betrayal. One quickly learns that Eric was devoted solely to himself. In 1559, he even betrayed his own sister, Cecilia, in the most egregious manner. Upon discovering the unwed Cecilia in bed with a man, Eric promptly instigated a massive scandal by informing everyone, nearly destroying his sister in the process. By all accounts, Eric was a physically robust, handsome man, and his portraits depict a ruddy complexion and closely trimmed reddish blonde hair. He also favored growing his beard long, as was the fashion in Sweden at the time. As he matured into a vigorous young adult, Eric developed an interest in women. At 25, the crown prince promptly demonstrated his virility by selecting the attractive Agda Persdotter as his official mistress. He even nicknamed her Caritas, which is Latin for love. Yet despite all this, Eric was far from a genuine lady's pose. Man, when it came to selecting a royal bride, Eric was not merely unfortunate in love, he was doomed. The prince extended numerous marriage proposals to the most prominent female rulers of his era, including Renata of Lorraine and Mary, Queen of Scots, all of whom declined. However, his most humiliating experiences were reserved for his most renowned target. Like every other ruler of his time, Eric coveted the hand of Queen Elizabeth I, also known as the Virgin Queen, a title that likely indicates his courtship attempts ended in utter failure. Eric pursued Elizabeth for years while she kept him dangling. Then, when he believed he had nearly secured her, he hastily committed an act he would later rue. In 1560, Eric was so confident in his allure that he devised elaborate plans to voyage to England and persuade Elizabeth in person. But this came at a substantial cost. Eric abandoned his mistress, Agda Persdotter, in the process, as he would have no need for her as a married man. Eric's treatment of Agda appears even more cavalier considering the couple had two young children together, Virginia and Constantia, both mere toddlers when their father departed. But this was all to win the Queen of England's affections, except that is not what transpired at all. Just before Eric was to set sail for Queen and country, he received devastating news. His father, King Gustav I, had died, and Prince Eric was now King Eric XIV of Sweden. Eric promptly canceled his rendezvous with Elizabeth and swiftly set about establishing himself as one of Sweden's most despised rulers. Eric's initial act as king unequivocally demonstrated that Elizabeth I had evaded a catastrophe. The young king assembled all the Swedish nobles, including his half-brothers John and Charles, and summarily demoted them. He desired no one but himself to accumulate excessive power in the age of Eric, but matters proceeded to become considerably more sinister than that. As soon as Eric ascended to the throne, he inflicted upon his former mistress, Agda, yet another intolerable cruelty. For one, despite his marriage plans collapsing, he never reinstated her in his bed. But that was not even the most egregious part. He then also accused Agda of being an inadequate mother and dispatched their daughters to reside with his sister. Eric was not off to an auspicious beginning, but in 1563, his courtiers began to observe even more disconcerting behaviors from their ruler. The king was becoming violent, paranoid, and somewhat illogical regarding his reign and his adversaries. In particular, he began to suspect all his nobles were conspiring against him. It was the genesis of what would evolve into full-blown madness. King Eric was self-absorbed, so it is unsurprising he was not overly fond of his half-brothers, John and Charles. That aversion soon morphed into bitter cruelty. When John wedded an influential noblewoman without seeking his consent, Eric became apprehensive about his brother's authority and promptly had him incarcerated for high treason. Somehow, Eric had an even greater perceived nemesis than his brother, a man named Niels Sture, the heir of a prominent Swedish family. Why did Eric's fury fixate on Sture? Because he was deranged, that is the reason. Niels and the rest of his lineage had done virtually nothing to their king, yet that did not deter Eric from exacting a brutal retribution. Initially, King Eric subjected Niels to capricious and heinous punishments under fabricated accusations of dereliction of duty. The king condemned Sture to execution, but not before subjecting him to several hours of torment in the dungeon. Then at the 11th hour, he altered his decision and commuted the death sentence to a most peculiar humiliation. On June 15, 1566, Eric XIII compelled his adversary, Niels Sture, to traverse the streets of Stockholm in a dilapidated carriage while donning a straw hat, which is ostensibly the Swedish equivalent of shame. To exacerbate the indignity, Sture's wounds were still visibly bleeding, but as we shall discover, Eric was not precisely appeased. Commencing in 1565, Eric XIII acquired a new love of his life, and this one would alter history. One day, Eric was imbibing with his court musician when he beheld his stunning serving wench, the comely Karin Mansdotter. The king swiftly designated Karin as his exclusive mistress, but she became much more. Eric had had paramours previously, but Karin was exceptional. He was so utterly captivated by the unassuming maid that rumors circulated within the court that Karin was a sorceress, or that she had compensated a witch to concoct a love potion for the king. Naturally, no witchcraft was implicated, but that does not imply matters did not become peculiar in other respects. Though notorious for his ruthlessness, King Eric XIII could also be lavishly generous, and he embarked on his own personal My Fair Lady narrative with his new mistress. He furnished Karin with an entirely new wardrobe, attendants, and her own chamber at court. He even instructed her in reading and writing. Yet throughout this period, the young woman was concealing significant baggage. Reportedly, when Karin entered into the royal liaison, she was not precisely unattached. She was already betrothed to a man named Maximilian, whom she callously but judiciously discarded the instant Eric began to focus his attention on her. Well, apparently Maximilian did not comprehend the message, for he returned to haunt her. One day, while Karin was luxuriating in the royal palace, Maximilian surreptitiously gained entry and endeavored to persuade her to return. This proved to be a fatal misjudgment. According to one account, King Eric discovered him and had the unfortunate Maximilian executed summarily. In 1566, Eric was still evidently fixated on securing a royal bride and determined his old foe, Niels Sture, could atone for his transgressions and assist him. Eric dispatched Niels as an official bridal envoy to Renata of Lorraine, enlisting the unfortunate man to conduct his wooing. This may appear to be a reconciliation, except Eric was being utterly deceptive. By this juncture, Eric was already scheming to undertake a scandalous maneuver. He aspired to wed his upstart mistress, Karin, not Renata, and Sture's mission was merely a pretense. But this subsequent segment becomes genuinely unhinged. Eric was paranoid his courtiers would endeavor to obstruct the nuptials, and he once again fixated on Niels as the scapegoat for his paranoia. Thus, the Butcher King enacted his sanguinary vengeance. In May 1567, the king's obsession with Niels tragically coincided with a complete mental collapse. Just as Niels was returning from his spurious mission, Eric apprehended him at Uppsala Castle, along with Niels' father Svante and a handful of other nobles, essentially proclaiming he could wed whomever he desired. Eric's subsequent actions have been immortalized in infamy. King Eric XIV's conduct in the ensuing days and hours was more than merely erratic. He had manifestly lost all contact with reality. He meandered through the dungeons at Uppsala Castle, at times even imploring the Stures for absolution for his misdeeds. Still, he never made any move to liberate them. And then it became even more unsettling. While Eric permitted one of his lackeys to conclude the deed on Niels, the king then proceeded to Patriarch Svante Sture's cell and delivered an utterly chilling discourse. While Svante was kneeling, Eric articulated an illogical apology, explaining how he now had to execute him as well, since the nobleman would never pardon him for his son's demise and would seek retribution. So following this bloodshed, was King Eric XIV finished with his violent breakdown? Absolutely not. Prior to departing the castle, he commanded his men to massacre most of the remaining detainees. After all, they too would never forgive him, resulting in this cascading effect of unforgivable actions. His guards complied, but even this was insufficient to rouse the deranged king from his state. Upon exiting the castle, Eric encountered his former cherished tutor, Dionysius Burrus, who promptly endeavored to pacify the unhinged monarch. It was a benevolent gesture, but Eric's subsequent actions substantiated his insanity. The king expressed his gratitude to Dionysius for his assistance by directing his men to slay the tutor as well. The repercussions of the so-called Stura murders are as harrowing as the event itself. When the turmoil subsided, 5 men had perished that day. Most disconcerting of all, though, is that for a brief duration, it was Sweden's most closely guarded secret. The guards merely feigned that the prisoners were still alive and persisted in accepting sustenance from their family members. And as for Eric, in the delirium of his heinous acts that day, Eric wandered into a forest and vanished for 2 entire days. The Mad King of Sweden was nowhere to be located, even as his courtiers both fervently searched for him and endeavored to conceal his royal transgressions. On May 27, 1567, they ultimately located him. When the royal court rediscovered their king, he was in an even more peculiar state than when he initially disappeared. Not only was he still in the throes of his breakdown, but he was also attired as a peasant and had materialized in the diminutive village of Odensala. They escorted him back to Stockholm and his throne, but it was far from a restoration to normalcy. When Eric reinstated himself at the royal palace, still as mad as a hatter, under a regency, he discovered his halls eerily deserted. You see, anyone with any sense desired absolutely nothing to do with their deranged king, lest they endure one of his temperamental outbursts and find themselves 6 feet under. Instead, the court had to introduce their clandestine asset, his mother. Now, Eric's biological mother was long deceased, but he did maintain a close rapport with his stepmother, Katarina Stenbock, and the courtiers determined she was their sole recourse. They dispatched her from her residence to Stockholm, and Katarina became the first individual to encounter Eric since his homicidal spree. His reaction was heart-rending. Reportedly, the instant Eric beheld his stepmother, he prostrated himself and commenced beseeching mercy for his multitude of transgressions. Katarina must have heeded, for she dispensed penance in the form of reparations. The king was obligated to compensate the slain nobles Apos, families, and vowed never to approach them again. But Eric was not finished making imprudent decisions. The king may have been thoroughly unhinged at this juncture, but that did not signify he had overlooked his cherished Karin Mundsdottir. Indeed, his fixation with Karin appeared to intensify in his madness. And now that all the purported objectors were conveniently eliminated, he wedded her in a clandestine ceremony on December 29, 1567. And then in an official one in 1568, but this too nearly culminated in carnage. Erratic lunatic or not, Eric possessed one consistent modus operandi, and in the prelude to his nuptials with Karin, the king reverted to presuming everyone was a conspirator. He intended to execute his detested half-brothers for fear they too would endeavor to thwart the union. And he only spared them through a miraculous twist of fate. His unfortunate bride-to-be, Karin, had to intervene to prevent Eric's fratricide by alerting his stepmother of her unhinged groom's schemes. Astutely, the king's siblings did not attend the wedding ceremony, thereby preserving their lives. But this proved to be Eric's critical error. According to court records, King Eric experienced a transient period of recovery in 1568 and commenced resuming official royal responsibilities once more. Yet his conduct still did not appear rational. One day, his personal secretary uttered something derogatory about a friend of his, so Eric impaled the man with a fire iron, dispatching him to the grave. Eric genuinely cared for Karin and expended vast sums endeavoring to legitimize her as his authentic queen. Even though she was a peasant, it did not merely backfire, it detonated in his face. The court disdained her wholeheartedly and the animosity proliferated. Ultimately, Eric's apprehension materialized. His marriage was the ultimate catalyst in his downfall. In a peculiar twist of fate, Eric's initial mistress, Agdapr's daughter, somehow ended up back in his bed years after he abandoned her. The couple had another illegitimate child in 1564. At that juncture, however, it was unequivocally not an exclusive arrangement. Eric had so many paramours by then that the court dubbed them the Frillahopen, or the throng of mistresses. Although the court disseminated preposterous witchcraft rumors concerning Karin Mundsdottir's influence on Eric, these rumors were not necessarily that far-fetched. The king actually harbored an obsession with the occult, particularly astrology. He had initially become suspicious of a poor Niels Sture because his horoscope indicated a light-haired man would succeed him. One of the most renowned portraits of Erik Thorton Unfar possesses a rather mortifying backstory. One of the sole full-length depictions we possess of him is a portrait Eric dispatched to Queen Elizabeth when he was endeavoring to court her, portraying him as an incredible bachelor deserving of her hand. The entire time Eric was gradually unraveling, his brothers John and Charles were observing from the periphery, awaiting their opportunity to strike. Well, in 1568, merely months following the royal wedding, they finally pounced. The nobles revolted and installed John in power. Meanwhile, they incarcerated Eric in a dungeon. Both King Eric and his unfortunate Queen Karen were detained together as they languished for years in captivity while the government denounced the king as insane. Their treatment was appalling. Eric and Karen had 2 children in captivity together, but the frail, sickly parents had to observe helplessly as both infants perished in abysmal conditions. And further heartache was imminent. As a prisoner, King Eric XIV was both too intelligent and too unhinged for his own welfare, and he plotted at least one escape from his cell, ingeniously employing Karen's lady-in-waiting. It concluded in tragedy nonetheless. The new regime apprehended and executed the conspirators, though Eric XIV and his queen were permitted to retain their lives, this time at least. On June 14, 1573, the erstwhile King Eric's custodians compelled him to endure one final indignity. To prevent the king and Karen from producing any additional offspring, they separated the royal couple, relocating Karen to a different castle. And he had become too substantial a menace to remain alive. But it was not until scientists autopsied his remains that we discerned the complete somber verity regarding the Mad King's demise. In 1958, forensic specialists exhumed the king's body to uncover the mysteries of his final moments. They made a grim revelation. According to their findings, conspirators had dispatched Eric with arsenic, and the substance ravaged his body until his final breath. The tragic and bizarre tale of Erik Bertorninov of Sweden illustrates the perilous consequences of unchecked power and mental instability. His reign, marked by erratic behavior and brutal decisions, serves as a cautionary tale of how personal demons and a profound lack of empathy can unravel a ruler's legacy. Born into a royal family, Eric's early life was overshadowed by the death of his mother, and his subsequent emotional neglect seemed to shape his harsh and self-centered personality. His early intelligence was overshadowed by his growing paranoia, and his actions increasingly became those of a tyrant who trusted no one and feared betrayal at every turn. As Eric ascended to the throne, his reign was defined by cruelty and suspicion. His paranoia led him to imprison and execute those closest to him, including his brothers and former allies, on imagined charges of treason. One of the most notorious events of his reign, the Sture murders, marked the apex of his madness. The brutal killings of several prominent Swedish figures, including his perceived enemies, revealed the depth of his insanity. His obsession with control, whether through his relationships with mistresses or his violent actions, led to a catastrophic breakdown of his rule. Eric's descent into madness was not merely political, but deeply personal. His relationships, especially with women, were complicated by his erratic behavior and inability to maintain any semblance of normalcy. His obsession with Karen Mansdotter, a serving maid he ultimately married, served as both a reflection of his declining mental state and a symbol of his desire to assert dominance over the nobility. Yet even in the depths of his madness, Eric continued to make reckless decisions, including attempting to execute his half-brothers in the midst of his obsession with his royal marriage. Ultimately, Eric's mental collapse led to his deposition and imprisonment, where he would spend his final years in isolation. His reign was marked not by the glory and success typically associated with monarchy, but by the ruin of his kingdom and his own reputation. The tragic trajectory of Erik XIV demonstrates the destructive power of a ruler who allowed personal grievances, paranoia, and mental illness to guide their decisions. His story remains a poignant reminder of the importance of mental stability and compassion in leadership, and the devastating effects when both are absent. If you relish this video, please contemplate bestowing upon us a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel for additional superb videos.